Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and in this video we are continuing part 5 of the Warlord Titan project. We're going to be focusing on the legs this time and making sure that you never skip leg day and getting those toes on, the hip pistons together, all of the hip joints done, and we're going to be leaving off the armour panels for ease of painting. So we're just going to cover all of that all the way up to sort of where the torso is going to join onto the leg section itself, and we'll make sure that we're all nice and steady, and just some of the hints, tips and tricks that I've done in order to make sure that this build is as smooth as possible. If you are enjoying this series, guys, and you want to keep up to date with all of the progress of the Warlord project and any of my other videos, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and press that bell button for future notifications of all my video uploads. But in the meantime, let's crack straight into this video. So as with most of this video series, I am running at 2 times normal speed, otherwise the video would be rather long, but you should be able to get the gist of exactly what's going on screen. So I've got all the feet parts and all the piston parts all laid out, and I've just gone through and make sure that I have everything that I need. So there's a bunch of shins, there's all the feet, there's some little side plates that go in between the feet, the piston rings, and then a whole bunch of little pistons that get in the way. So I'm just test fitting everything once again before we go for the adhesive section. You can see here that there's piston rings that go in between where the legs join the hips. And what you want to do is when you're assembling these, leave them free spinning, so don't attach those until you're ready to do the pistons themselves. Now the reason for that is you want to obviously make sure that the orientation to the way that you've set the legs up is perfectly straight, or at a jaunty angle enough for the pistons to be able to reach between the piston ring and the leg section itself. And you can see there the piston ring moves and then the piston can adjust just to make it look a bit more dynamic. The trusty 2-part JB Weld is going to be coming out in order to secure the leg sections to the hips, but everything else I'm actually just going to use regular super glue for. So I use regular Gorilla Glue, the gel format, in order to attach the piston rings and the pistons themselves. So just mixing up a piece of JB Weld ready to go. This is what I'm now run out of, and this is the best stuff in the world for gluing or adhering your resin components on this kind of scale. It does not come apart. It is brilliant. And I'm still not on commission. I really need a sponsorship from those guys. So just one final test fit, because I do have a couple of different hole positions that I had in there. I just want to make sure that we're all good to go. It's a nice snug fit. You can see I've already put that piston ring on. That's not in the way, that isn't glued. I'm just applying the adhesive here to the pin, and then it'll be on all the flush sections where the actual joint is going to occur. Now, using this spatula isn't probably the best way of evenly applying this stuff. So what I'm going to use is actually a cotton bud, which I'm not even sure that's probably the best, but it turned out to be quite good because the bud itself, the cotton piece, doesn't separate, and it does mean that I can smear this stuff nicely around the receiving socket and around the protruding socket that's going to go into that thigh, or the top of the thigh section really. So it turned out to be quite a nice little idea really, even though there's probably better ways of doing it, but this seemed to work for me. So just grabbing that, I just used it to try and get the rest of the JB Weld off of the spatula actually. It turned out that, you know what, if you just smear this around here, it actually worked out rather nicely, and then just doing exactly the same on this section gets a nice even coat. So that was a bit of a bonus really. So once we have those sections, just making sure that that is still free spinning, get the JB Weld out the way, little rub of the hands, and then we can attach these two pieces together. So nice and easy. Now my Warlord is in a striding pose. The legs aren't splayed as such. I know a lot of people have kind of splayed their legs, which is actually quite difficult if you're going to pin, but not so difficult if you're just going to use JB Weld. So mine are striding forwards in a big sort of walking fashion rather than sort of standing in some kind of dynamic super pose. Now you see here I've broken out to the trusty spirit level. Now I think this is very important when you've got a top heavy model. Now the weight of the top section plus all the guns that are going to go on it, you want as stable a platform as possible for that to sort of rest on. So I'm using a spirit level here to make sure that when these components are all attached, that the center section is completely and utterly horizontal to the table. So we can do I did a quick test fit there as I laid that down, and then we can apply the JB Weld to the second leg, and then what we'll do is we'll micro adjust based on the spirit level results to get that perfect flush fit. So just using the spatula to get most of this stuff out and then into the right location, and then I'll just use that cotton bud again just to smear it around so that it's got a two-part, well, it's adhered to on both parts, and then it will just sort of cold fuse together when we push the two components together. So exactly the same as the first one. So yep, just smear that round with the little cotton bud, earbud, and then just inside on that receiving cup there, and then we are good to go. Just make sure you put that cotton bud somewhere where it's not going to go everywhere. And you can see I got a little bit smeared around, so I'm actually just using a tissue slightly off camera there just to make sure that I wipe any excess off. Otherwise, I mean, you can remove it, but it is a little bit of a pain once it's completely fused. So best to do it while it's still malleable. So you can see here now that the legs are attached, and what we're going to need to do is make sure that those are under compression whilst this stuff dries. Now, a good time for this stuff to cure is about 24 hours, but it will begin to sort of set after about 25 to 30 minutes. So you don't have much working time before it starts to become a little bit unusable, or it starts to fuse and you don't have any wiggle room with it. So just using cable ties. Now you would have seen that I used cable ties in a previous video, basically because clamps and everything else are just too big and too unwieldy, and well, some of the clamps actually were too small even with the larger clamps. So using cable ties in this format really does work. So I'm just really making sure, again, once it's now cable tied under compression, that everything is perfectly parallel to the desk. Now my desk mat has a little bit of a kink in it, so I'm not entirely happy with that, and I'll address that in a second. And the other thing to worry about is when you're leaving this unattended overnight, is to make sure the feet don't slip apart just under the weight of the model. So you can see here I keep sort of making sure that the feet are fluff to the floor, but as I leave them they do begin to splay by sort of 5 or 6 millimeters, which isn't what I'm looking for. I'm looking for perfectly flat feet on the base that it's going to go on. So a little trick here that I've done is to use cable ties again, so they hold each other in place. And you can see here exactly what I've done here, just so they don't splay under their own weight whilst this stuff is going to dry unsupervised overnight. Just making sure everything is as tight as it can be, and then that should be us good to go with these sections drying now. As I said, the desk is a little bit wobbly. It's not the desk itself, it's the mat. It seems to have got some kind of warp in it, and I don't really want that while it's drying. So what I'm going to do is put a 12-inch board section down in a second, and then use that as my flat level for attaching the feet. As with all FORGEWORLD, you know you are measuring twice and cutting or gluing only once. So keep checking with that spirit level to make sure that you haven't knocked it and it's drying in the right way, and that it's not going to bend over in any way, shape or form, because once it's done, you're not undoing this. And you know, as everyone knows, these are not cheap models, so you want to make sure you get it right first time. So keep measuring, measure again, and if you're not sure, measure once more before you use any kind of adhesive. So these are the toes. So there's 4 toes per side, and then there's also these weird flappy sections as well that go between the toes. But I'm not going to be attaching those. They'll be a little bit easier to paint separately as well. So those will go on afterwards. As I said, I'm going to put this onto a 12-inch flat board, and this will allow me to make sure that the surface is perfectly flat, because I know this board is as flat as it can be, rather than the mat which has got that kink in it. And I can attach the toe sections now, and they'll be completely flat. Now, this model does allow you to be really flexible with the pose. You can have the heels raised up, the toes raised up, knee sections, hip sections, you name it. You can put these models in any kind of dynamic way that you want. But then you do run the risk of a very unstable Warlord Titan. As I said, the top heavy nature of this is pretty horrific. If you compare this to a Warhound Scout Titan, you can make that striding on one leg and all the rest of it. The top heavy nature of that isn't so bad. It's quite centralized weight distribution, so you can be really quite posy with the Scout Titan. But this thing, my recommendation is to make sure that you've got the stability of that center section over both feet, weight distribution nice and even, and make sure that he's flat-footed. It's, in my opinion, probably the safest way to do it, especially if you're going to use this model as a display piece, because let's be honest, it's going to come out and game not very often. at 6,000 points and God knows how many power levels, 400 power level I think it is. Yeah, it's not realistically going to see much light of day, so it is your display piece that you might have in your hobby room or wherever you can get away with in your house. So you want to make sure that it is as stable as possible, isn't going to tilt over and cause further damage or break. So anyway, enough rambling, let's get back onto the build. So we're mixing up more JB Weld again, and this is what we're going to attach the toes with. I'm using this rather than super glue to attach the toes because this forms a lot of the core stability of the model, right? So when all these toes are on, this thing isn't going anywhere. And let's be honest, this is a display piece in the most part. So if you've got it up on a shelf or whatever, you want it to be as stable as possible. You definitely don't want this thing falling over. And in my opinion, if you use super glue, that has a tendency underweight to be able to snap because it's the glue that's holding the pieces together. There's no real fusion going on there, no fuse. It's not like two plastic parts being melted together by plastic glue. This stuff isn't going anywhere. So that's why I do recommend using an adhesive like this or a really strong 2-part epoxy resin rather than super glue here to do this. Especially if you've gone with a really funky dynamic pose as well. Once all the toes are on them, we end up in this position. So we've still got the cable ties all going on and all the toes are done. So yeah, we've still got the free spinning hip piston ring. So what we can now do is, while everything is beginning to dry and set, we can actually move on and do those piston rings and get the pistons into place. Now the pistons and piston receivers come in a number of different thicknesses and lengths. There's some actually for the arm sockets. Then there's 2 large ribbed pistons for the bottom side of this, and then there's 5 on each side of the smaller ones. Now each piston is adjustable by cutting the length of it. So if you, depending on the flex, especially if you splayed the legs out at those hip joins, you might want a slightly longer piston where the maximum side of the splay is, and then a shorter piston at the other side, as conversely one side has to be shorter than the other. Now all my pistons are going to be pretty much the same length because I've got it striding forward and there's no sort of splayed leg going on here. So all my pistons I can just cut to the right length and we're good to go. Now underneath though, the pistons I did need to cut pretty short because I think they are expecting you to maybe sort of push the legs out a little bit more than I've done, but these work perfectly well, and all I'm going to do is just apply that super glue first to the piston ring because I can gauge exactly where it needs to go now that the legs are attached, and you can see the corresponding receiving piston housing on the leg itself. And if you take one of your pistons, you can just sort of test fit it just before that super glue dries. This gives you that last few seconds before it begins to go off and you can't adjust it anymore, and then we can start attaching the pistons. So I've based that off the bottom piston going on first, and all I'm going to do is work around where my hands can reach. I'm putting super glue into the piston receiver end, and then super glue it again on the piston head end and the piston receiver other end as well. So there's 3 bits of glue here, so one on the actual piston into the piston housing, and then the other bits. Now what I'm doing here is just sanding each end as well, because that means the super glue would adhere a bit better rather than on perfectly smooth resin. And you can also score into them if you really wanted to, but these pieces are not really sort of going to go anywhere, right? Once they've been super glued in at 2 points, the likelihood is they're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to knock them, you're not going to really touch them once they're attached. And we'll just repeat that for the other side, and that is that. So there we go then, guys. That is part 5 done. That is all of the leg sections all complete, ready for priming, so we can start getting some paint down on those very soon. The final video of this build series is going to be the remains of the torso section. So we've got quite a few bits and pieces still to go on that, but it's not too bad to finish. It's some of the secondary weapon systems like the las cannons, the Mauler bolt cannons, the shoulder mounts, the side armour panel mounts, and some rear rails, I think it is. But disaster has struck. I am out of JB Weld. I have run out, and I won't be able to get any more for the next couple of days. So I'm not going to be able to complete that video until next week, unfortunately. But I do have a fresh delivery of Dominus class knights to be cracking on with. So expect videos on those very soon. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I shall catch you guys on the next video.